Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of Dennis Nilsen and the long, chilling winter of 1978. Close your eyes and imagine London as it was then, a landscape of charcoal skies and heavy, damp fog that seemed to cling to the very skin of the buildings. The air in North London carried the sharp, biting scent of coal smoke and the earthy aroma of wet pavement. We are moving slowly, our footsteps muffled by the mist, through the quiet streets of Muswell Hill and towards Cricklewood. The streetlights cast long, amber pools of light onto the cobblestones, creating pockets of warmth in an otherwise freezing world. It was a time of deep, biting cold, where every breath was visible as a ghostly plume in the air. We are approaching a modest, yet imposing Victorian house on Melrose Avenue. This is where the first shadow began to stretch its long fingers across the next 5 years. The world outside is receding, leaving only the sound of the wind rattling the single-pane glass and the distant, low hum of a city settling down for the night. The house at number 195 Melrose Avenue stood as a silent sentinel in the frost. Its brickwork was dark with the residue of decades, and the large, bay windows looked out onto the street like tired, unblinking eyes. Inside, the flat was a labyrinth of narrow corridors and high ceilings that held the chill of the winter months. Dennis Nilsen lived here in a state of meticulous, bureaucratic order. He was a man of 33 years, working for the civil service at a local job center, a figure of unremarkable reliability to those who saw him daily. But inside the walls of his home, a different reality was taking shape. There is a specific kind of silence that exists in a house where loneliness has taken root. It is heavy and almost tangible, like the dust motes dancing in a stray beam of light. The floorboards offered a rhythmic, wooden groan underfoot, a sound that Nilsen had become accustomed to in his solitary hours. He spent his evenings surrounded by his books and his records, creating a world that was entirely his own, away from the judgmental eyes of the public. On the night of December 30th, 1978, the world was preparing for the turn of the year. The Cricklewood Arms pub was a sanctuary of flickering golden light and thick, humid warmth, a stark contrast to the freezing winds sweeping through the streets outside. The air inside was heavy with the scent of hops, stale tobacco smoke, and the damp wool of coats drying near the radiators. It was a place of boisterous laughter and the rhythmic clink of heavy glass mugs, where strangers could easily disappear into the crowd. Among them was Stephen Holmes, a boy of only 14 years. He had been to a concert nearby and was wandering the city, a young soul looking for a moment of connection or perhaps just a respite from the biting cold. Nilsen sat there, a quiet, bespectacled man who radiated a sense of harmlessness. He watched the room through the lenses of his glasses, a silent observer blending into the background of a Saturday night. When their eyes met, it wasn't with a flash of danger, but with a simple, quiet invitation. Nilsen offered the boy a drink and the warmth of his flat, a gesture that seemed like a rare act of kindness in an indifferent city. The walk from the pub to Melrose Avenue was a journey through a landscape of ice and silver frost. Their footsteps made a synchronized, crunching sound on the pavement, echoing against the rows of darkened houses. They passed under the skeletal branches of trees that reached upward like dark lace against the charcoal sky. There was a strange, hypnotic quality to the walk. The world felt empty, as if they were the only two people left in London. Nilsen spoke in a low, soothing monotone, his voice a steady hum that served to calm any lingering nerves the boy might have felt. When they reached the heavy wooden door of 195 Melrose Avenue, the sound of the key turning in the lock was a final, definitive click. Inside, the flat was waiting, its air still and heavy with the scent of old wood and tea. Nilsen moved with a practiced ease, putting on a record to fill the silence. The music began with a soft, rhythmic crackle, a sound that felt both cozy and deeply unsettling in the dim light of the living room. Stephen sat down, unaware that he had just crossed a threshold into the stillness. As the record played, the domestic peace of the flat became a fragile mask. The transition from a guest to a victim happened in a heartbeat of silence. There was no struggle that would pierce the thick Victorian walls. The act was as quiet as the snowfall outside. Nilsen's descent began not with a roar, but with a chillingly calm realization of power. He moved with a terrifying deliberation, his hands becoming instruments of an internal darkness that had finally found its expression. The boy, so full of unlived years, became the first anchor for Nilsen's long voyage into the abyss. After the world went quiet, Nilsen sat for hours, watching the shadows dance on the ceiling as the night deepened toward the dawn of a new year. He felt a distorted sense of peace, a feeling that he had finally captured something that could never leave him. The body of Stephen Holmes was hidden beneath the floorboards, a tragic testament to the beginning of a 5-year nightmare. Outside, the first light of the new year began to gray the sky over London, but for those inside the flat, the shadow had only just begun to fall. The silence of Melrose Avenue was now a secret, kept beneath the wood and the dust. The walk from the Cricklewood Arms to the quiet residential stretch of Melrose Avenue was short, but on a cold December night in 1978, it felt like a passage into another world. 195 Melrose Avenue was a classic Victorian semi-detached house, its red bricks damp from the London mist. To any passerby, it was merely another house in a row of many. But for the man approaching the front door, it was a fortress of his own making. He lived in the ground-floor flat, a space he had once shared with a partner named David. But by late 1977, that companion had left, leaving behind a silence that was almost physical. Dennis Nilsen would turn his key in the lock, the click echoing through the hallway. Inside, the air was still, save for the rhythmic patter of paws on the floorboards. Bleep, his border collie cross, would be there to greet him, the only living soul who truly knew the shape of his days. Inside, the flat was a testament to a domestic ideal. After his partner left, Dennis had spent hours redecorating, painting the walls and laying down carpets to create a home that felt permanent. In the small kitchen, the kettle hummed as he prepared tea, the steam rising against the backdrop of a meticulously organized life. He was a man of habit, a civil servant who spent his days at the local job center on Denmark Street. In those offices, he was seen as a dependable, if somewhat outspoken, clerk in a gray suit. He was the man behind the desk, a cog in the machine of the civil service. But when the sun dipped below the horizon, he became a seeker. He looked for those who, like himself, felt the weight of the city's indifference. He searched for the boys and young men drifting through the cracks of the late 1970s, those with no place to go and no one to miss them. Loneliness was the engine that drove him into the bars of Soho. He would sit at the Golden Lion or the Salisbury, nursing a drink and watching the faces in the crowd. He was not looking for a brief encounter. He was looking for a reflection of his own need for connection. When he found someone who looked vulnerable, perhaps a runaway or a traveler with nowhere to stay, he would approach them with a polite kindness. The offer was simple: a warm meal, a place to sleep, and perhaps a drinking contest to pass the hours. To a young man shivering in the cold, Dennis was a savior. He would lead them back to 195 Melrose Avenue, promising that the night did not have to end in the frost. As they walked through the front door, the smell of cooking and the sound of a record player suggested a safety that was entirely false. The trap was made of hospitality. Once inside the flat, the atmosphere was curated to induce relaxation. Dennis would put on his favorite classical records, the works of Grieg or Stravinsky, and the music would fill the rooms, masking the sounds of the neighborhood. He would serve generous helpings of spirits, encouraging his guests to drink until the world became soft and blurry. He enjoyed the role of the host, talking for hours about his time in the Army Catering Corps or his views on the world. He wanted his guests to feel they had finally found a friend. As the young men leaned back in the armchairs, the warmth of the flat and the alcohol would take hold. They would watch Bleep resting by the heater, the picture of domestic peace. They did not see the shadows in the corners, or the way Dennis watched them with an intensity that went beyond friendship. For him, the most beautiful guest was the one who might never leave. The transition from host to predator was a meditative process. As the clock ticked toward the early morning, the domestic mask remained, but the intent shifted. It was often in the deepest quiet, when the guest had fallen into a heavy sleep, that the killing trance would descend. Dennis would look at the sleeping figure and feel an overwhelming fear of the coming dawn. He knew that when the sun rose, the guest would wake up and walk out of the door, leaving him alone with the silence once more. To him, the departure was a form of abandonment he could not endure. The first time this impulse took hold was in December of 1978, with Stephen Holmes, a boy of 14. The boy needed a place for New Year, and Dennis provided it. But as the night wore on, the desire to keep the boy forever became a physical pressure. He would reach for a tie, his movements methodical and calm. The air in London during the late 1970s was thick with more than just the usual river mist. It carried the weight of a city in flux, a place where a person could disappear into the neon-lit shadows of a pub and never truly return. For the man living at 23 Melrose Avenue, the world outside was a reservoir of the forgotten. He walked those streets with a predatory stillness, watching the young men who drifted through the West End, those with nowhere to go and no one to catch them if they fell. The transition from the 70s to the 80s brought a cold, sharp edge to the city's anonymity. In the pubs around Piccadilly and Soho, the music was loud enough to drown out any goodbye. In December of 1979, the cycle of silence deepened with the arrival of Kenneth Ockenden. He was a 23-year-old Canadian student, a traveler seeking the history of a grand old city. He was vibrant and curious, yet he met a man who offered a warm meal and a place to listen to music. They shared drinks and talked of maps, but as the music played, the journey ended. Kenneth became a fragment of a lost soul, hidden beneath the floorboards. He was the only one whose disappearance truly made the headlines, yet even the frantic searches of his family could not penetrate the door of Melrose Avenue. The police looked, but they did not see. They filed his name away as another traveler who had simply moved on without a word. As 1980 dawned, the darkness intensified. In May, a 16-year-old boy named Martin Duffy arrived at a railway station. He was a runaway from Birkenhead, a child who had slipped through the cracks of society. He was looking for a new start, but instead found a man offering a bed for the night. The tragedy of Martin was his absolute vulnerability. He was a boy who still looked like a child, yet he was treated with a cold, clinical finality in a kitchen sink. After he was taken, his absence was felt by a family who never stopped looking, yet in the eyes of the law, he was just another drifter. The flat at Melrose Avenue began to feel crowded with secrets, the floorboards groaning under the weight of the invited. The list of the lost continued to grow. In August of 1980, William Sutherland, a 26-year-old father from Edinburgh, vanished into the same void. He had come to London to find work, visiting the very job centre where his killer was employed. He was a man with ties to the world, yet his disappearance was swallowed by the city's indifference. Then came Billy Allen and others whose names were lost to time, known only by the fragments they left behind. Each man was a life interrupted, a story cut short. They were more than just statistics. They were people with favorite songs and unfinished dreams. The cruelty of this period lay in the ease with which these men were erased, their identities slowly fading into the wallpaper of a silent, secondary world. The lack of a police connection during these years remains a haunting aspect of the narrative. The authorities were often blinded by the prejudices of the age. Because many of the victims were homeless, or belonged to the marginalized gay community of the early 1980s, their disappearances were frequently dismissed. Reports of attacks by survivors were brushed aside as domestic disputes or simple lovers' quarrels. There was no centralized database, no forensic web to catch the predator. The police did not see a serial killer. They saw a series of unrelated incidents involving people they considered disposable. This systemic indifference acted as a shield for the man at Melrose Avenue. He knew that as long as he chose his victims from the shadows, the law would remain oblivious. By the time 1981 arrived, the flat was a house of echoes. The domestic mask was beginning to fray, yet the world outside remained unaware. Neighbors might have noticed a strange smell or the sound of a late-night bonfire in the garden, but in the urban sprawl, it was easier to look away. The fragments of lost souls were now part of the very structure of the house. The rituals continued: the bathing, the dressing, the quiet conversations with those who could no longer speak. Each act was a desperate attempt to stave off an all-consuming loneliness. The silence of the city was his accomplice, and the floorboards held their breath, waiting for the day when the truth would finally rise. For now, the darkness was complete. The garden at 195 Melrose Avenue was a quiet place. But beneath the grass and the sagging fence, a dark history was being buried. For 8 months, the remains of the first victim had stayed beneath the floorboards, but by August of 1979, the air in the flat was becoming heavy. Dennis knew he had to act. He stepped out into the damp London evening, a man with a task that looked, to any passerby, like simple garden maintenance. He began to gather wood. He cleared a patch of earth. It was the beginning of a ritual that would define his years in Cricklewood. The smoke rose into the night, carrying with it the secrets of a life cut short, while the city hummed on, oblivious to the pyre. The bonfires became more frequent as the months turned into years. Between 1978 and 1981, the garden saw 3 major burnings. Dennis learned through trial and error how to manage the intensity of the flames. Rubber tires were an effective addition. The thick, acrid scent of burning rubber was common enough in the industrial edges of London to act as a chemical veil. It masked the sweet, cloying odor that might otherwise have alerted the neighborhood. He would stand there, silhouetted by the orange glow. He was a man of precision, a former army cook who understood the properties of heat and matter. To him, this wasn't an act of desecration. It was a final tidy-up, a way to clear the stage for the next guest. The ash would settle into the soil, mingling with the roots, a hidden cemetery. During the day, Dennis was the image of a reliable civil servant. He worked at the job center, helping the unemployed find a path. His dog, Bleep, was his most loyal companion. They would walk the streets of Cricklewood, a familiar sight. He was polite, perhaps a bit aloof, but never suspicious. This facade of normalcy was his greatest shield. When a neighbor mentioned the smoke or the odd smells coming from his garden, he had a ready answer. He claimed he was burning rubbish and old tires. The neighbors accepted this. Why wouldn't they? He wasn't a monster in their eyes. He was just the man from flat 195 who kept to himself. This disconnect between the man at the pub and the man at the pyre was a chasm. Inside his mind, the justifications were solid. He didn't see himself as a predator. He described his victims as ships passing in the night. He claimed he only wanted their company, a way to stave off the crushing loneliness. When the guests died, they didn't really leave. They moved from the chair to the floorboards, becoming a permanent part of his domestic landscape. He would talk to them, watch television with them, and play his records. The bonfires were simply the moment when the physical presence became too much to manage. He believed he was treating them with a kind of post-mortem respect, a ritualistic sending-off that preserved their memory in the smoke and ash of his own private, distorted world. By the autumn of 1981, the situation at Melrose Avenue was reaching a breaking point. The landlord wanted to renovate the property and offered Dennis £1,000 to move out. It was a fortune, but a logistical nightmare. The floorboards were full. The garden had already absorbed so much. On October 4th, 1981, the day before he was due to leave, Dennis prepared his largest fire yet. The remains of the last 5 victims were brought out into the garden. It was a massive undertaking. The flames licked high, the smoke billowing into the darkening sky. He stood there, perhaps for the last time in that garden, watching the remnants of his companions turn to gray dust. He felt a sense of relief, a clean slate. The next morning, October 5th, he packed his bags and his dog and moved his life to the attic flat at 23 Cranley Gardens. He left behind a garden that looked ordinary, but held the fragments of 12 or 13 lives. The bones were buried deep, hidden beneath the new grass. As he closed the door on Melrose Avenue for the last time, he believed he was leaving the darkness behind. He didn't know that the echoes of those bonfires would follow him, and that the smoke he had sent into the London sky was only the beginning of a long, slow unraveling. The shadows were lengthening, but for now, the garden was silent and the fire had finally gone out. The city remains indifferent as the past is paved over, yet the ground remembers everything it has consumed. October 5th, 1981, marked a new chapter in a narrative already stained by the unthinkable. As Dennis Nilsen climbed the stairs of 23 Cranley Gardens, he was carrying more than just his belongings and his loyal dog, Bleep. He was carrying the momentum of a man who had already claimed 12 lives. The move from the ground floor of 195 Melrose Avenue to this top-floor attic in Muswell Hill was meant to be a transition, a shedding of the past paid for by a £1,000 incentive from a landlord eager to renovate. But as he reached the final landing, the architecture of his crimes began to shift. The sprawling, wild garden of his old home, a place of hidden bones and evening bonfires, was gone. In its place was a cramped, sloping world of wood and porcelain, perched high above the unsuspecting neighbors who lived beneath his feet. The attic flat was advertised as bright and airy, offering impressive views over the rooftops of North London. To any other tenant, the large windows and the elevation would have felt like a sanctuary, a quiet retreat from the gray bustle of the city. But for Nilsen, the space was a structural challenge. The floorboards here were tight, the joists shallow, and there was no soft earth beneath them to swallow the evidence of his nights. He found himself living in a glass bowl, essentially trapped by the very height he had initially admired. The silence of the attic was profound, broken only by the whistling wind and the occasional creak of the building settling. He paced the small rooms, mapping out the geography of his new existence, realizing that the methods he had refined over the previous 3 years would no longer suffice in this elevated, restricted cage. At Melrose Avenue, the garden had been his silent partner. He could bury organs near the fence or construct massive bonfires under the cover of smoke and rubber tires to mask the scent of burning flesh. Now, in late 1981, he was faced with a clinical dilemma. There was no soil here, only the hard wood of the attic floor and the thin walls that separated him from the lives of others. The lack of outdoor space forced a grotesque evolution in his process. He could no longer rely on the purifying flame of an open fire. Instead, he turned his attention to the kitchen and the bathroom. The kitchen stove, a modest appliance intended for the preparation of simple meals, was repurposed into a tool for dismantling the dead. He began to experiment with the application of heat in a much more controlled and localized environment. He began using a large aluminum stock pot, the kind one might use to simmer a heavy winter stew. In the quiet hours of the evening, the blue flame of the burner would flicker, and the water would begin to roll. He found that by boiling certain parts of his victims, specifically the heads, the hands, and the feet, the flesh would eventually loosen and slide away from the bone, making the remains much smaller and easier to manage. The steam from these sessions would rise, thick and heavy, coating the kitchen windows in a milky shroud that blurred the lights of London outside. He would stand there, perhaps listening to music or stroking the dog's fur, as the air in the small flat grew humid and sickly sweet. It was a ritual of reduction, a way to make the human form disappear into something unrecognizable, and more importantly, something that could be moved. What could not be boiled or flushed was tucked away in the shadows of the attic architecture. He utilized the eaves and the narrow cupboards, stowing remains in plastic bags and tea chests. In the summer months, the heat beneath the roof became stifling, and the stagnant air within the flat began to carry a heavy, cloying weight. He fought the scent with an arsenal of disinfectants and air fresheners, spraying the rooms until the chemical smell was as thick as the decay it sought to hide. He lived in constant proximity to the remnants of his victims, sometimes keeping them in wardrobes just inches from where he slept or ate. The psychological toll of this physical closeness seemed to feed his detachment. He was a man living in a tomb of his own construction, yet he maintained the outward appearance of a dedicated civil servant, leaving for work each morning as if the attic were empty. The most significant change in his concealment strategy, however, was his new reliance on the Victorian plumbing of the house. The toilet in the attic flat became his primary disposal site. He would cut the boiled flesh into small, nondescript pieces, scraps of muscle and skin that he believed would simply travel through the dark labyrinth of pipes and vanish into the city's vast sewer system. He trusted the water to carry away his secrets, flushing the porcelain bowl over and over again, watching the remains swirl and disappear. He convinced himself that the system was efficient, that the organic matter would simply dissolve or be washed away by the rains. He did not consider the age of the building or the narrowness of the pipes that ran down the side of 23 Cranley Gardens. He did not realize that he was slowly, meticulously, choking the very throat of the house. The toilet in the attic was more than just a convenience. It became a dark conduit, a way to make the impossible disappear within the cramped confines of 23 Cranley Gardens. When Dennis moved into this top-floor flat in October 1981, the shift in geography brought about a profound shift in his psychology. At his previous home on Melrose Avenue, he had the luxury of a garden, a place where the earth could swallow his secrets and the open air could carry away the smoke of his bonfires. But here, high above the streets of Muswell Hill, there was no soil to dig into. The attic was a world of slanted ceilings, narrow hallways, and a sudden, sharp intimacy with the structure of the building itself. He was closer to the sky, yet he had never felt more trapped. The four walls seemed to pulse with the weight of what he brought inside, and the lack of an outdoor escape forced him to turn his focus inward, toward the very bones of the apartment. The floorboards in the attic flat were old, seasoned timber that spoke in a language of groans and sharp cracks. Every step Dennis took felt like an intrusion on a silence that was becoming increasingly heavy. Though he could no longer lift these boards to hide his victims as he had done before, the memory of that practice lingered like a phantom limb. He walked across the wood with a delicate, haunting precision, aware that only a few inches of lath and plaster separated his private horrors from the lives of the neighbors living directly beneath his feet. The floor was no longer a foundation. It was a thin, vibrating membrane. He would sit for hours in the dim light of the living room, listening to the muffled sounds of television sets and clinking silverware from the floors below, wondering if they could hear the whispers of his own conscience or the rhythmic, unsettling sounds of his nightly activities. The claustrophobia was not just physical. It was a layering of lives, with his own dark narrative pressed tightly against the mundane existence of the world outside. Because he could not use the floor for concealment, the attic flat became a gallery of makeshift tombs. He utilized a large tea chest and a wardrobe, turning everyday furniture into vessels for the macabre. Imagine the psychological toll of such a configuration. In a space so small that one could walk from the kitchen to the bedroom in a handful of steps, Dennis lived in a constant state of proximity to his crimes. He would sit and listen to his records, the music of Grieg or Pink Floyd filling the air, while just a few feet away, the physical evidence of his isolation sat draped in plastic bags or hidden behind thin wooden doors. The wardrobe, once a place for suits and coats, now held a presence that redefined the room. He was a man living in a museum of his own making, where every object had a double meaning and every shadow in the corner seemed to have a weight of its own. This confined environment intensified his detachment, creating a dreamlike state where the line between the living and the dead became dangerously thin. The air in the attic became its own character in this unfolding tragedy. In the summer of 1982, the heat would rise and settle under the roof, baking the small rooms and drawing out the scents he tried so desperately to mask. He became obsessed with the atmosphere, spraying cans of floral air fresheners and burning sticks of incense, until the air was a thick, cloying tapestry of lavender and rot. It was a perfumed tomb. He would open the windows to let in the cool Muswell Hill breeze, but the relief was always temporary. The smell was a persistent whisper, a reminder that the physical world has a way of betraying the most careful of planners. He would scrub the surfaces with disinfectant until his hands were raw, trying to wash away the invisible stains of his deeds. But the attic seemed to absorb the essence of what had happened there. The walls themselves felt porous, as if they were slowly drinking in the secrets he tried to keep. He lived in a state of perpetual sensory battle, fighting the light, the sound, and the very air he breathed. As his desperation grew, the escalation of his methods took a turn for the truly grotesque in the small kitchen. With no garden to burn remains, he turned to the stove. He would stand over a large cooking pot for hours, the steam rising to fog the windows and obscure the view of the street below. To any passerby, it might have looked like a lonely bachelor preparing a late-night meal, but the reality was a systematic attempt to dismantle the evidence of his victims. He boiled the remains to make them easier to dispose of through the plumbing, a process that was as technically difficult as it was psychologically harrowing. The condensation would drip down the walls, and the heat from the stove would make the small kitchen feel like a furnace. This was the peak of his domestic horror, the blending of the most mundane household chores with the most extreme acts of desecration. He was a civil servant by day, walking the gray streets of London and filing paperwork, only to return to this high-altitude laboratory of the macabre, where he labored under the flickering yellow light of the attic. By the time the winter of 1983 arrived, the attic was reaching its breaking point. The reliance on the Victorian plumbing had reached a critical mass. Dennis had been flushing small fragments and organs down the toilet for months, believing the pipes would simply carry his burden away into the vast, hidden network of the city sewers. But the ancient drains of Cranley Gardens were not designed for such a load. Below the floorboards, in the darkness of the pipes, a blockage was forming, a physical manifestation of his mounting crimes. He began to notice the water rising in the bowl, the sluggishness of the drain, and a new, even more pungent odor rising from the depths. Even then, his hubris remained intact. He viewed the plumbing failure not as a warning, but as a technical nuisance. The psychological walls were closing in, mirrored by the narrowing of the pipes. He was a man standing on the edge of a precipice, living in a beautiful, terrifying bubble of his own creation, unaware that the very house he lived in was about to scream his secrets to the world. The winter of 1983 arrived with a biting, damp clarity that seemed to freeze the very air over Muswell Hill. Inside the red brick walls of 23 Cranley Gardens, a subtle but persistent change was manifesting. The house, a sprawling Victorian structure divided into separate flats, was beginning to experience a technical failure that would soon become an existential one. It started in the early days of February, as the internal rhythm of the building's plumbing began to falter. Residents in the lower apartments noticed that the water in their sinks would linger, spinning in slow, reluctant circles before finally disappearing with a hollow, wet groan. The air in the communal hallways took on a new, heavy quality, a scent that was not quite the sharp sting of sewage, but something more organic, more cloying, and altogether more unsettling. It was a smell that seemed to seep through the floorboards, a silent messenger of the rot that had been accumulating in the shadows of the pipes. By the 5th of February, the frustration among the tenants had reached a breaking point. The drains were no longer merely slow, they were effectively on strike. In the flat directly below the attic, the occupants found themselves unable to use their facilities without a repulsive backup of gray, stagnant water. The landlord's agents were flooded with complaints about the mounting stench and the unusable plumbing. In a display of chilling audacity, Dennis Nilsen himself joined the chorus of the aggrieved. On the 8th of February, he sat at his desk and composed an indignant letter to the property managers, complaining in formal, civil servant tones about the disgusting state of the drainage system. He spoke of the hardship it caused the residents, positioning himself as a concerned neighbor while the very source of the blockage sat just feet away in his own kitchen, a collection of remains that he had spent weeks trying to systematically flush away. The response to the crisis arrived in the form of a bright yellow van belonging to a company called Dynarod. On that same Tuesday evening, the 8th of February, a maintenance worker named Michael Catran pulled up to the curb of the leafy residential street. He was a young man, accustomed to the mundane filth of urban life, hair clogs, grease traps, and the general debris of domestic living. As he stepped out into the freezing night air, he carried with him the heavy metal coils and rods of his profession. The sound of his boots on the frost-covered driveway was sharp and rhythmic, a mechanical intrusion into the quiet suburban evening. He was met by several of the house's tenants, who were eager for a resolution to the foul-smelling mystery that had taken over their home. Among them was the man from the top flat, Dennis, who watched the proceedings with a quiet, expectant intensity that most mistook for helpful interest. Michael led the group to the side of the house, where the main inspection cover for the drainage system lay embedded in the ground. With a heavy pry bar, he labored to lift the iron lid, which came away with a grinding, metallic shriek that echoed against the brick walls. As the cover was cast aside, a thick, nauseating cloud of steam and rot billowed out from the darkness. Michael lowered his torch into the depths, the beam cutting through the murky air to reveal a sight that would haunt him for years to come. The pipe intended for liquid waste was choked with a thick, grayish-white sludge, a substance that looked like a revolting, curdled porridge. It was approximately 8 inches deep, and as he moved his rod through the mass, he realized it was not composed of fat or paper. It was made of dozens of small, stringy pieces of flesh that had caught on the rough interior of the Victorian plumbing. The silence that fell over the small group gathered around the manhole was heavy and thick. Michael reached into the drain with a pair of long-handled pliers, pulling up a few of the larger fragments to examine them under the harsh glare of his torch. They were pale, having been washed clean by the constant flow of water, but their texture was unmistakably organic. He found 3 or 4 small bones, each with a distinct knuckle at the end, looking for all the world like the remains of a human hand. Dennis Nilsen, standing close to the technician, looked down at the gruesome pile of evidence. With a calm, almost conversational tone, he offered a suggestion that was as absurd as it was bold. He remarked that it looked as though someone had been flushing a large amount of uneaten Kentucky fried chicken down the toilet. It was a desperate, dark joke, a final attempt to steer the narrative back toward the mundane world of household waste. Michael Catran, however, was not convinced. The smell was too distinct, the shapes too familiar to be anything but biological. He informed the gathered tenants that the situation was far more serious than a simple clog, and that he would need to return the following morning with his supervisor, Gary Wheeler, to conduct a more thorough investigation in the light of day. He mentioned the possibility of involving the police, a suggestion that caused a ripple of unease to pass through the group. As the yellow van pulled away from the curb, leaving 23 Cranley Gardens in the grip of a cold, expectant silence, the reality of the situation began to settle into the soil. High in his attic flat, Dennis Nilsen knew that the technical turning point had been reached. The resistance in the pipes had finally given way, and the truth, long suppressed in the shadows of the plumbing, was about to rise to the surface. The morning of February 9th, 1983, arrived with a biting, persistent chill that seemed to settle into the very bricks of Muswell Hill. As the sun struggled to rise over North London, casting a pale, watery light across the rooftops, Michael Catran returned to the property at 23 Cranley Gardens. He was accompanied this time by his supervisor, Gary Wheeler. The air was so cold that their breath bloomed in thick white clouds, and the ground was slick with a thin layer of frost that crunched under their heavy work boots. They stood together by the manhole cover, the same one Michael had peered into the previous evening. There was a heavy, expectant silence in the street, broken only by the distant hum of early traffic and the sharp cry of a lone bird. Michael felt a knot of apprehension tightening in his stomach as he prepared his tools. He knew that what lay beneath the heavy iron lid was not a routine problem. It was something that defied the logic of his trade, something that felt fundamentally wrong in a way he could not yet articulate. When they pried the manhole cover open once more, a confusing sight met them. The massive blockage that Michael had seen the night before, that dense, grayish-white mass, was gone. The main channel of the sewer appeared mysteriously clear, as if the problem had simply vanished into the dark subterranean flow. But the lingering scent in the air told a different story. It was a thick, cloying odor of decay that the freezing wind could not sweep away. The two men stood for a moment, puzzled, until their eyes adjusted to the shadows of the brick-lined shaft. It was then that they noticed a smaller branch pipe, a secondary artery of the building's plumbing that fed into the main line. It was nestled further back, partially obscured by the damp grime of the walls. Using a long, specialized tool, Michael reached into this narrow opening. With a slow, deliberate tug, he pulled back a small collection of debris that had become snagged on a protrusion in the pipe. As the objects emerged into the morning light, the breath caught in his throat. There, resting on the damp pavement, were 4 small, distinct bones and several scraps of pale, waterlogged flesh. The bones were unmistakable. They were delicate, yet sturdy, possessing a structure that Michael recognized instantly from his own hands. These were not the remains of a discarded meal. They were not the bones of a chicken or a stray animal. They were human. The reality of the discovery settled over the two men like a shroud. The supervisor, Gary Wheeler, took one look at the fragments and reached a grim conclusion. The maintenance job was over. They retreated from the manhole, their movements stiff and hurried, and made the call that would change everything. At Hornsey Police Station, the report of human remains in a residential drain was met with a mixture of professional skepticism and immediate urgency. Detective Chief Inspector Peter J. was assigned to the case. He was a man of experience, a quiet thinker who had spent years navigating the darker corners of the city. Yet even he could not have anticipated the scale of the horror that was about to be unspooled from that single North London address. By the time the police arrived, the atmosphere at Cranley Gardens had shifted from a neighborhood nuisance to a cordoned-off scene of profound mystery. The remains were carefully collected and rushed to a forensic pathologist, David Bowen. As the detectives waited for a preliminary assessment, they began to piece together the layout of the house. The drain in question was linked directly to the top-floor attic flat. The other tenants, huddled in their coats, spoke of a man who lived above them, a quiet, unremarkable civil servant who worked at the local job center. They mentioned his name, Dennis, and described him as a polite neighbor, though some recalled hearing strange, rhythmic scraping noises coming from the attic late at night. One tenant mentioned seeing a figure by the manhole around midnight, just hours after the plumber had first visited. It became clear that the resident of the top flat had tried to clear the evidence under the cover of darkness, unaware that the Victorian pipes had held onto the truth. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, the word came back from the pathologist. The confirmation was chilling. The remains were undeniably human, and one piece of flesh bore the unmistakable indentation of a ligature mark, a sign of strangulation. This was no longer a case of accidental disposal. It was a hunt for a killer. Detective J decided on a strategy of patience. He and two other officers took up positions near the entrance of the property, blending into the winter gloom. They waited for the man in the attic to return home from his mundane day at the office. The street was quiet, the windows of the surrounding houses beginning to glow with the warm, yellow light of evening lamps. For hours, they watched the gate, the cold seeping through their overcoats. They were waiting for a monster, but when the suspect finally appeared at approximately 5:30 in the evening, he looked like anything but. He was a man of medium build, wearing silver-framed glasses and a nondescript suit, carrying himself with the weary posture of an ordinary commuter. The detectives stepped forward as the man reached the gate. Peter J. introduced himself, his voice calm and steady in the freezing air. He explained that they were there to discuss a problem with the drains. The man, Dennis Nilsen, looked at them with a flick of confusion behind his spectacles, his expression controlled. He asked, with a touch of polite indignation, why the police were interested in a plumbing issue. Jay didn't answer directly, instead asking if they could continue the conversation inside his flat. As Nilsen led them up the narrow, winding stairs to the very top of the house, the air began to change. With every step toward the attic, a heavy, sickly sweet odor began to permeate the hallway. It was the scent of 1,000 secrets, a smell so potent it seemed to cling to the wallpaper. When Nilsen turned the key and opened the door to his home, the officers were hit by a wall of decomposition so overwhelming it made their eyes water. In the dim light of the small apartment, the ordinary facade of the civil servant began to crumble, and the true weight of the evidence finally came to light. The detective explained that they were investigating a serious blockage in the drains of the property, one that had revealed human remains. Dennis Nilsen stood under the dim yellow glow of the street lamp, his breath hitching slightly in the frozen air of February 9th, 1983. He looked every bit the tired civil servant returning from a long day at the job center, clutching his plastic carrier bags. For a brief, flickering moment, he played the part of the shocked resident. He adjusted his spectacles, his eyes wide behind the glass, and uttered a small exclamation of dismay. Where could such a thing have come from? He wondered aloud, his voice thin and reedy against the biting wind. But Detective Chief Inspector Peter J. was watching him closely. He saw the way Nilsen's hands remained steady despite the horrific nature of the news. There was no true panic, only a polite, surface-level concern that felt like a coat worn for the sake of appearances. Jay suggested they move inside, away from the prying eyes of the quiet suburban street, to discuss the matter further in the privacy of Nilsen's attic flat. The walk up the stairs of 23 Cranley Gardens was a slow, heavy ascent. Each wooden step groaned under the weight of the men, a rhythmic creaking that echoed through the narrow, damp stairwell. As they climbed higher toward the top floor, the atmosphere began to shift. The crisp, clean scent of the winter night was replaced by something thick and stagnant. It was a smell that seemed to cling to the wallpaper and the threadbare carpets, a cloying, sweet rot that no amount of open windows could truly dispel. Nilsen led the way, his movements fluid and strangely graceful, as if he were hosting a common social gathering rather than leading the police to the scene of a nightmare. He fumbled with his keys at the door of the attic flat, the metal chiming softly. As the door swung open, the scent intensified, a wave of chemical air freshener struggling and failing to mask the heavy, organic odor of decay that resided within the walls of the small apartment. Once inside the small living space, the tension in the room became almost physical, a pressurized silence that weighed on the chests of the officers. DCIJ did not waste time with pleasantries. He looked around the room, noting the tidy stacks of papers and the unremarkable furniture of a lonely man. He asked Nilsen directly where the rest of the remains were located. The facade of the shocked neighbor finally crumbled, not into a heap of confession, but into a terrifying, icy calm. Nilsen didn't blink. He didn't look away. With a simple, casual gesture, he pointed toward a large wardrobe sitting in the corner of the room. He told the officers that they would find what they were looking for there, in 2 black plastic bags. The lack of emotion in his voice was perhaps the most jarring part of the encounter. He spoke as if he were pointing out a misplaced library book or a bag of old clothes destined for a charity shop, rather than the dismembered fragments of human beings. The officers approached the wardrobe with a professional stoicism that masked their internal revulsion. When the doors were opened, the reality of the situation became undeniable. The bags were there, heavy and silent. Peter J. turned back to the man in the spectacles. He officially arrested Dennis Nilsen on suspicion of murder, reciting the caution in a low, steady tone. Nilsen listened intently, nodding his head as if he were receiving instructions at work. There was no resistance when they led him back down those same creaking stairs and out into the night air. He walked to the waiting police car with his head held high, his expression neutral. The neighbors, if any were watching from behind their curtains, would have seen a man being led away with the quiet dignity of someone who had expected this day to come for a very long time. It was a surreal procession, the civil servant and the detectives, moving through the shadows of Muswell Hill toward the station. Inside the police car, the heater hummed softly, and the streetlights of London blurred into long ribbons of light against the glass. Nilsen sat in the back, staring out at the passing city he had hunted in for years. DCIJ sat beside him, the weight of the discovery at the flat still fresh in his mind. He wanted to know the scale of the horror they had just uncovered. He leaned in and asked a question that he expected would lead to a long, arduous investigation. He asked Nilsen if they were talking about one body or two. The answer came without a second of hesitation. Nilsen didn't even turn his head. He simply replied that it was 15 or 16, and that his campaign of silence had begun back in 1978. The number hung in the air of the car, cold and impossible. 15 or 16 lives, extinguished in the quiet corners of North London, while the world moved on outside his door. The detective was stunned into a temporary silence, realizing that the man beside him was not just a murderer, but one of the most prolific killers in British history. Nilsen continued to speak in that same level, conversational tone as the car made its way to the police station. He mentioned that he wanted to tell them everything, that he wanted to get it off his chest. It was as if a dam had burst, not of guilt, but of a desperate need to be known, to finally reveal the dark masterpiece he had been composing in the shadows of Melrose Avenue and Cranley Gardens. The officers listened, their pens frozen over their notebooks, as the numbers and dates began to spill out into the night. The calm confession was only the beginning of a long journey into the mind of a man who saw his victims as nothing more than the remnants of a feast, the dirty platters left behind once the hunger was gone. As the car pulled into the station lot, the gravity of the confession settled over everyone involved. The mystery of the blocked drains had unraveled into a tapestry of death that would haunt the city for decades to come. The halls of Hornsey Police Station were flooded with the artificial, humming yellow of 1980s fluorescent lights. It was late on the evening of February 9th, 1983, and a biting London wind rattled the window panes in their frames. Dennis Nilsen walked through these corridors not as a struggling captive, but with a strange, compliant poise. He still wore his steel-rimmed spectacles and his sensible overcoat, looking for all the world like the civil servant he had been for so many years. Behind him, the detectives felt the heavy weight of the unknown pressing against their shoulders. They had come from the cramped, foul-smelling flat at 23 Cranley Gardens, carrying with them the knowledge of things no person should ever have to see. Now, the silence of the station was about to be filled with a narrative that would redefine the word horror. Inside the interview room, the air was thick with the scent of stale tobacco and the faint, metallic tang of industrial floor cleaner. Detective Chief Inspector Peter J. sat across from Nilsen, watching the man's face. There were no raised voices, no banging on tables. Nilsen asked for a cigarette, his fingers steady as he struck the match. He began to talk in a voice that was disturbingly level, a calm, rhythmic baritone that lacked any edge of panic. He did not wait for the detectives to pry the truth from him. He offered it up like a gift. He spoke of his victims not as people he had hated, but as ships that had passed in the night. To him, the killings were a series of unfortunate, inevitable events, a desperate attempt to keep the silence of his own loneliness at bay. It was in this room that the magnitude of the case truly shifted. In the car, the numbers had been vague, perhaps 1 or 2, maybe 3. But as the clock ticked toward the early hours of the morning, the tally began to climb. Nilsen leaned back, staring into the middle distance as if reading from a ledger only he could see. He mentioned 15, then 16. The air in the room seemed to vanish. 15 young men had disappeared into the shadows of North London over the course of 5 years, and the world had barely noticed. The detectives, seasoned men who had seen the worst of the city's underbelly, were left breathless. This was no longer just a localized crime at a single address. It was a mapping of a vast, hidden graveyard that spanned years and 2 different homes. Recognizing that many of his victims were young men on the fringes of society, runaways, drifters, and those the city had forgotten, Nilsen offered to help the police with their identification. He asked for paper and pens. With a practiced hand, he began to draw. The scratch of the pen on the paper was the only sound in the room as he sketched the faces of the men he had killed. Some drawings were detailed, capturing a specific jawline or the tilt of a head. Others were hauntingly faceless, mere outlines of memories that had blurred into the static of his mind. He gave them names when he knew them, but often he only had descriptions. The boy with the leather jacket, the young man from the pub. These sketches became a gallery of the lost, a visual map of the silence he had created. While Nilsen drew, the forensic teams were beginning the agonizing task of sifting through the physical evidence. At the station, the evidence bags began to pile up. There were jars containing fragments of bone so small they looked like gravel. There were pieces of tissue that had been recovered from the drains of Cranley Gardens and the floorboards of his previous home at Melrose Avenue. The contrast was jarring. Nilsen's clinical, almost poetic descriptions of the dirty platter after the feast sat alongside the grisly reality of 1,000 tiny human remnants. The pathologists faced a nearly impossible challenge. How could you give a name to a person when all that remained were fragments the size of a thumbnail? They were tasked with reconstructing lives from the debris of a man's obsession, a puzzle where most of the pieces had been intentionally destroyed. Despite the difficulty, the heavy silence of the past 5 years slowly began to break. The first name to emerge from the darkness was Stephen Sinclair. He was only 20 years old, a young man from Perth in Scotland who had fallen through the cracks of the care system. His identification within 48 hours gave the investigation its first solid anchor. Then came others, Martin Duffy, who was only 16, William Sutherland, who had a family searching for him, and Malcolm Barlow. Each name was a small victory for the detectives, a way to restore humanity to those Nilsen had tried to erase. Yet, for every name found, many more remained just sketches on a page. Nilsen himself admitted he did not know who some of them were. They were the forgotten generation, young men who had come to London seeking light, only to find a cold shadow waiting in a quiet flat in Muswell Hill. The year 1983 drew toward its close with a biting chill that settled deep into the stone of London. On the 24th of October, the heavy doors of the Old Bailey swung open for a trial that had captured the city's darkest fascinations. Imagine the scene, the gray sky hanging low, the mist clinging to iron railings. People gathered in hushed groups, watching the prison van arrive. Inside that vessel was a man who had become a ghost in his own story. The world was about to hear the full extent of the silence he had kept. The pavement outside felt hard and indifferent, echoing the footsteps of those seeking justice for the young men who had vanished into the shadows. The air was thick with expectation, as the trial began its long, somber march toward a final, heavy truth. Inside court number 1, the air was heavy with the scent of floor wax and the metallic tang of ancient heating pipes. The mahogany paneling rose high, absorbing the whispers of the gallery. When the man took his place in the dock, the room seemed to contract. He sat with a stillness that was unsettling, his spectacles catching the dim light of overhead lamps. He looked less like a monster and more like a clerk who had lost his way, yet the weight of the charges against him pressed down on everyone. 6 counts of murder, 2 counts of attempted murder. Each name read aloud by the clerk felt like a candle being lit in a dark room, illuminating the faces of those no longer here. The rhythmic ticking of a distant clock was the only sound in the silence. The prosecution laid out the evidence with clinical, numbing precision. They spoke of the floorboards in Melrose Avenue and the drains in Cranley Gardens. They described mundane items, cooking pots, plastic bags, and old letters that had been transformed into tools of a terrible history. The jury listened, their faces pale against the dark wood. The defense did not deny the acts. Instead, they spoke of a mind fractured, a man drifting through a fog of diminished responsibility. They brought in experts to dissect a soul that seemed to lack the basic colors of human empathy. We can almost hear the soft rustle of paper as the barristers shuffled their notes, the sound like dry leaves skittering across a tombstone. The trial became a meditation on the nature of evil versus the nature of a profound, hidden illness. Day after day, the details emerged, each more somber than the last. Witnesses who had narrowly escaped the same fate spoke with voices that trembled like thin glass. The courtroom felt smaller with every testimony, the walls closing in as the map of the crimes was drawn in stark, unyielding lines. Outside, the city of London continued its frantic pace, oblivious to the heavy silence being deconstructed within the Old Bailey. Yet, for those inside, time had slowed to a crawl. The light changed from the pale yellow of morning to the deep indigo of autumn evenings. The man in the dock remained a figure of stone, watching with an analytical detachment, as if he were a student observing a lecture on his own life. It was a performance of haunting normalcy that chilled the very blood. After days of deliberation, the moment of reckoning arrived on the 4th of November, 1983. The jury returned to a room so quiet you could hear the soft creak of the leather seats. The verdict was unanimous: guilty of murder. The judge, his voice steady and grave, handed down a sentence of life imprisonment, with a recommendation that the man serve at least 25 years. This was later increased to a whole-life tariff, ensuring the shadows of his past would be confined within a cell until the end. The impact of the case lingered long after the doors were locked. It changed how Londoners looked at their neighbors, a reminder of how easily a monster can hide in plain sight. The houses in Muswell Hill remained, but their names were forever changed in history. The decades passed, and the man grew old behind bars, eventually passing away in May of 2018. The city has moved on, the old wounds have scabbed over, and the painful memories have begun to soften at the edges. The names of the victims are what remain now, vibrant lives that were cut far too short, now honored in the quiet spaces of our remembrance. As we leave the cold stone of the Old Bailey and the narrow streets of North London, we find a true sense of peace. The ghosts have been heard, the story has been told, and the weight of the past is finally set down. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.